Good morning and welcome to Side Spot. It's a little brisk outside. I hope you're inside with a hot cup of coffee and with your feet up and little furry socks on and ready to get started for this show. Last week we were talking about childhood trauma. Well, actually we were talking about just trauma in itself, and we were talking about some of the conditions related to trauma. So this week we're going to actually follow up with childhood trauma and some of the risks for future trauma, which is a whole different experience in itself that we tend to minimize. We don't look at our own condition and what it is we're going through from the separation from the other parent, and a lot of times because we find ways of coping with that trauma, we tend to not see what the child is going through with the circumstance of the separation. So experiencing trauma in childhood can have a severe and long-lasting effect. Children who have been traumatized see the world as a frightening and dangerous place. When childhood trauma is not resolved, the fundamental sense of fear and helplessness carries over into adulthood, setting the stage for further trauma. So childhood trauma results from anything that disrupts a child's sense of safety and security, including an unstable or unsafe environment, separation from a parent, serious illness, intrusive medical procedures, sexual, physical, or verbal abuse, domestic violence, neglect, and bullying. So our primary focus during this particular segment is related to the separation from a parent. Now, funny thing is, separation from a parent is one aspect of the trauma, but if the separation came on the heels of domestic violence, if it came on the heels of some level of abuse, physical, verbal, or sexual abuse, then there's even more that the child and or the parent has to contend with. And I say and or because sometimes if you find out that there has been some level of abuse put upon the child, then you're dealing with it differently. If it's a matter of, just bear with me for a minute here. I'm hearing an echo in the background, which was coming from one of the other monitors up here in the studio. If you find out that something has been happening to the child, then the way you internalize that is a lot differently than if the abuse was actually happening to the child, because then the child is internalizing the actions of that parent upon him or her. So it varies in terms of intensity. In terms of long-term and lasting effects of this abuse, that would really be determined by how the non-abusing parent internalizes it and begins to help the child to work through that process. When we talk about the emotional and psychological symptoms of the trauma, of the traumatic event, then we start looking at shock, denial, or disbelief. To know that you have been leaving your child in the hands of the other parent and thinking that that parent is being loving and caring towards the child, and you find out that it's been the complete opposite, sure, you're in disbelief by that. That's the parent. How can the parent possibly treat their child harshly, abusively? I can't. You can't fathom that thought. So you're in disbelief about this. You're in shock about it. You just can't. Your father was what? Your mother was what? Why didn't you tell me? And we almost find ourselves in a mode of chastising the child for not saying anything, when you should really be asking yourself why the child didn't tell you. And it's not a matter of being punitive towards yourself for this not happening, because there are a variety of reasons why children don't report the abuse of the other parent. Sometimes they truly believe, they're convinced through a process that what's going on is the norm from that parent. That's how the parent parents. That's their style of parenting. So they don't challenge it. They don't question it. They just accept it because it's the other parent. And if that behavior towards them has been happening towards you, the other parent, then it certainly is perceived as being normal behavior. There's also a matter of it maybe being a secret. Many parents share secrets with their children and tell their child that this is between you and I. Sure, there should be some things kept between you and I because that's part of our bonding, but when harmful things are done to the child and termed as being a secret, then that's something totally different. That's something totally different. When you look at your style of communication with the child, when you look at how open you are to discussion from the child, that may very well have an effect on whether a child will or will not discuss with you such happenings. Now you put that with the separation. The parent is now out of the house. Now, and we'll speak first to the abusing parent. So if the abusing parent is no longer in the home, then the child will maybe begin to feel some level of safety and security, and begin to maybe have dialogue with you now about what was going on. But then they may not, because if the child has visitation, if the child is going to the other parent's home, or if there is some arrangement made where there's a supervised visit, or a visit that is not held like an overnight situation with the other parent, but just a day out, some day trips and things of that nature, then the child may not begin to open up. The child may, such as in my case, my father, God bless his soul, he's deceased now, but he was an alcoholic in my younger years when I was going to visit him, and he was very abusive. He was physically and verbally abusive to my mother. He was physically and verbally abusive to his children, to my stepmother, So I didn't want to go over there. So one day when it was time for us to go visit, my sister got her things together, went and got in the car, and my mother said I was upstairs crying. And she came upstairs and she asked me why I was crying. And I told her I didn't want to go and visit my father because he was mean. And she said, well, why didn't you tell me? And I don't recall what it was that I told her was my reason for not telling her, but I know she never made me go again. And for many years of my life, I did not want to have anything to do with my father because of what I saw him do to my mother, what I saw him do to my siblings and my stepmother. And you know, although he wasn't beating me the way he was beating them, it wouldn't have been long before he would have been beating me. See, my siblings lived with him. I didn't live with him. So when I came there, I was more like a guest, and I hadn't yet become acclimated to certain things that took place in the house with my siblings. I was just there on the weekends. So there were just some things that I hadn't fallen into as far as the environment. And most of my exposure to him was through his drunken tirades in many cases, because he, being an alcoholic, was drunk most of the time. But it carried well into my adulthood, and it wasn't until I was in, I guess I was in my early 30s, that I began to reestablish a relationship with him. But at that point it was brief, but a few years later it began to be a more productive, I'll say, relationship between the two of us. But it takes time, and it took a lot of time, and even today there are still some things that I relived that had taken place between him and I, and in our prior relationship during his drunkenness. And I don't allow that period to overshadow the positive of our relationship, but that was my process, and which is again a process that many children have to begin to go through, and the parent has to also become healthy in dealing with that situation themselves, and many times that is not the case. Another of the emotional and psychological symptoms related to the trauma of parental separation is anger, irritability, and mood swings. Now, let's talk about the parent, because the parent tends to take out their own frustrations upon the child, because the child is the closest one to them. And it also happens with a new partner, if it's a new partner involved in this relationship, because the reality of it is that happens. Sometimes we haven't even gotten entirely out of the tarnished relationship, the failed relationship, before we're into a new one. But there are also times when we may have been out of that bad relationship for some time, and are still carrying around the anger and the resentments towards that other parent that trickle into the new relationship. So we're angry ourselves. My mother often reminded me about how much I looked like my father, and about how much I was just like my father, and seeing how her own frustration of being a young mother played out upon my sister and I, and looking at how my mother didn't want children, but she took good care of us. But she always said, I didn't want children, but she got pregnant, and she got pregnant back to back, because my sister and I were only 11 months apart. So although she did not want children, it was very frustrating for her, very difficult for her, not only to be a young mother, but to have to be in a situation she was with, where she was with a man who beat on her. And then having to part ways from that man and go live on her own with 2 children, and having to do it alone. It was difficult for her. And she was angry. So her level of irritability initially was quite high. And as time went on and the behaviors of my sister and I through, just developing into teens, and that whole process is frustrating for a mother to have to do that on her own. I'm smelling myself, and I'm out there being involved in things I don't have any business being involved in. My sister being involved in things she didn't have any business being involved in. My mother trying to work a job and keep an eye on us, and she worked the second shift. So therefore, when we came home from school, she wasn't there. She wouldn't get into the late hour of the day. So it was quite frustrating. Child support was another issue. Him not paying it, going back and forth to court. All those frustrations that you experience as the parent, as the caregiving parent, trickles down into the relationship with the children. And sometimes we'll act like it doesn't. Sometimes we'll act like it doesn't. But it does, and we know it does. But that's part of your trauma from a separation. No matter how bad the separation was, there was a point in time in that relationship where there was some good, because you got together, you had children, you got married. Things changed for whatever reason, but it wasn't always that way. And there's an image that you have in your mind that when you have a child, or when you get married, there's a vision of, not necessarily the house on the hill, the white picket fence, but this certainly wasn't the planned life. Being beat on, being abused. No, this wasn't what the dream looked like. This wasn't what the vision looked like. And all that is shattered. And then you find yourself by yourself, having to do this alone. And imagine what the child is going through right now. Just imagine. Because this is the gap that happens in child rearing that continues to go unnoticed, continues to be minimized, and so many of our children are angry. And they're taking out their anger on others. They lash out at you, the other parent. They lash out at their siblings. They lash out in school. All these things happen, and instead of trying to understand where all this is originating, we tend to chastise the child for not being able to cope. When you can't even cope. You can't even cope. And you convince yourself that you are. But you can't even cope with the separation. Now you want a child who does not have the ability to comprehend and internalize things as an adult to be able to handle this? That wasn't part of their idea or vision either of family life. So think about how their dreams have been shattered. Think about it. But most of the times we don't. We don't even ask the child how we feel about the separation, how we feel about the divorce. We don't ask them any of those things. And typically what they do tell us when we do ask them, the one or two times that they're asked, is, I'm alright. That's on y'all. And we leave it at that. Guilt, shame, and self-blame are other psychological and emotional symptoms. Children begin to blame themselves for the separation, especially when they hear you always arguing about them. It's your child, you need to talk to him. He doesn't do this, he doesn't do that. They feel like they're to blame for the separation because they hear so many of the arguments about their behavior. Which again, why it's so important that when we're having our disagreements, that we shouldn't be having the disagreements in the house. And if we are having them in the house, we should be having them in our room with the door closed, with lowered voices, with civility. And most of the times when we're having conflicts, they're raised voices. So if you know that you have a tendency to raise your voice when having discussions about matters that are emotional ones, maybe you should have them outside of the house. Maybe you should go take a ride and go sit in the car in the garage, or sit on the driveway in the car together, so you don't have them in earshot of what you're talking about. A lot of times we tend to impact the child far before we even separate because of the conflicts that go on in the house. They know it's coming. It's obvious. It's obvious. You guys argue, fuss, and fight all the time about breaking up. You know, he's left this amount of times, you left certain amount of times. I come home, the police are here because you want him out. You know, all that drama. They know it's coming. And still, again, there's no discussion had with the child about what's really going on. And some of us don't even think that it's even necessary to have that discussion. The child did not ask to come into the circumstance. The child did not get an invitation, did not get anyone's bio to say whether I want to come and be in this family, whether I want this to be my parent, whether I want that to be my parent. They didn't get that invitation. We brought them into this circumstance willfully. Maybe in many cases irresponsibly, but willfully. We did this. Therefore, we need to be more respectful of our children, about the situations that we impose upon them. That's what we need to begin to do. You really need to know, if you haven't experienced it, what it feels like to participate in school events and to only have one parent there, or to have one parent sit in one set of chairs and the other parent sit on the other side in another set of chairs, and you know, you have to kind to be attentive to them both and wonder why can't they sit next to each other like Bob's and Scott's and Mary's parents are doing. They don't live together, but they're sitting together. They tend to vent together, and even if they do have a new partner, bring the partner there too. But have the discussion. Have the discussion. How do you feel about me bringing Miss So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so to the event? What are your feelings about that? Instead of asking the other parent, we'll ask the other parent what they feel about us bringing our new partner, but we won't ask the child anything. And we'll just show up with our new partners and sit into the crowds, and we're waving on this side and they're waving on the other side, and the kid is like, what is wrong with you people? And then we wonder why our children are so twisted in how they conduct relationships. They learn from us. Like everything else. They learn from us. They see the insanity that we live in, and they make it normal. So when they do it, we ask them what's wrong with them. So when they enter into their new relationships, they bring the insanity of that which they have seen around them. Then they bring into the relationship the trauma of the failed relationship in itself, which means that they're not going to know how to have healthy relationships with their partners. They're not going to know how. They don't have a go-to person because the two of you argue and fight so much that the other parent stays away. Right, wrong, or indifferent, I don't believe that any level of conflict between me and the other parent should keep me away from my child, but it happens. And sometimes it happens because, you know, you don't want to put more harm into the situation, so you stay away. You don't want to find yourself subjected to having a protection from abuse order taken out on you, and all you're trying to do is see your child, but all you keep getting is the residue of the failed relationship from the other parent. You don't need that. And this is what happens. This is what happens. It is so selfish of us to continue to fight our battle of a failed relationship on the backs of our children. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt. It didn't last long because it didn't make sense to me that we were going back and forth. But once I realized that I was acting on her from the response to my walking out of the relationship. Once I got past that, it's like, well, wait a minute, it wasn't working. I didn't see the rationale of staying together if we're not getting along, if we're not growing, if we're not, it's just not going anywhere. What's the point? And didn't understand that we got married for the wrong reasons. So I peacefully parted ways from the marriage. But then the end result was I started having conflict with being able to see my children. We continued to argue back and forth. And I say we because I was allowing my buttons to be pushed by her because she was hurt, so she was using those buttons to trigger my reactions, meaning then I would cut off my nose to spite my face and not being able to see my children. And that wasn't the desired outcome that I was looking for. So I learned how to cope with what was actually going on. And it was difficult for me because I wasn't dealing with my own trauma. Because I thought walking away from the marriage was it, but it was more to it than that. I was traumatized by the fact that I was no longer there with my children. And that took a minute to sink in. You know, the ability to say good morning to my children, good night to my children, good afternoon, to sit down and do all the things that we were accustomed to doing together, the family outings, the games, the things that we did as a family. That all changed. You know, falling and hurting themselves and me healing the wound by cleaning the wound, and, you know, I mean, all those kind of things that we as parents do, that was gone. And I didn't realize that I was traumatized by that. I didn't realize that I had myself gone through separation, trauma. But here's the thing. I told you earlier, my parents separated when I was a child. At a very young age, I was 5. How do you think that impacted me? Being faced with another separation, but this time it was me separating from my own children. The guilt, the shame kicked in like I had walked out of their lives. And I didn't walk out of their lives in the capacity of, you know, not being involved. I walked out of a relationship that was unhealthy. But it really wasn't any difference. I still separated from my children. And it was difficult. Having to make arrangements. Not being able to see them anytime I wanted to. And I had to do something about that. And I did. But I had help. I had help from people around me who had been through this, similar circumstances. People around me who had some spiritual principles, you know, to say, well, listen, you need to make use of this when you're talking to her. You need to stop calling her outside of her name. You need to stop getting angry and slamming the phone down. You need to start doing some things different. If you desire to have more time with your children. And that was my goal. That was my goal. So as a result of that, I stopped doing things that were a detriment, that were impediment to my desired outcome, and I started doing some things that made the situation a lot more easier and a lot less tense when engaging her. I stopped slamming the phone down when I got angry. I would just tell her that, you know, it's not going anywhere and I'll talk to you later. I stopped calling her outside of her name. And in just a short period of time with those things happening, when we went to court, it was cut and dry. We sat down, we talked, we knocked things out, went back into the courtroom, it was a done deal. And before you knew it, I was seeing my children whenever I wanted to. Whenever I wanted to. Didn't have the child support issues. I was doing what I needed to do, what I could do. But I say all this to say that there's more that we're going to talk about. There's more to all of this. And we need to stop minimizing the impact that parental separation has, not just on the child, but on us, and how we impose our own trauma upon our children, which we begin to kind of infect almost of a sort. We keep giving them our sickness. They're already sick, we give them our sickness, and we give them all of our symptoms. And then we don't look at their symptoms, and then their symptoms increase. And we're going to talk more next week about those symptoms and how they continue to manifest in the lives of the entire family. Again, thank you for joining me this morning, The Soft Spot. Be safe, stay warm, most importantly. We got some nasty weather coming tonight. But I'll see you on the other side. Peace. God bless.